This isn't just about Europe. This is about the United States finding a new way, but doing it through the thoughts of one person as a side project to everything else he's doing. Remember, what goes on in his head is the only strategic thinking that is happening in the United States right now. He has already ordered on multiple occasions for the Joint Chiefs to draw up military plans to seize it directly, which the US obviously could do very easily if it wanted to.
How does Europe confront this situation now?
But you're really going to hate this answer.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. He's been back in office for a year, though his critics say it feels like a decade. Certainly, Donald Trump is pushing his allies to the brink with threats to take over European territory and hardline trade policies if he doesn't get his way. Meanwhile, China and Russia, once considered America's enemies, watch on with apparent glee. And if the UK once thought flattery was the best form of defence, the president has put paid to that with potentially crushing tariffs and a swipe at Keir Starmer's Chagos Islands deal, an agreement he had supposedly signed off. So whether you're in an igloo in the Arctic, a boardroom in Berlin, or a car plant in Coventry, Donald Trump looms over everything. So how do we make sense of a global future in flux? Well, I'm joined by geopolitical strategist Peter Zeihan, who has appropriately enough forecast some of the world's biggest convulsions and crises. Thanks very much for joining us, Peter. I want to ask you first.
Sorry about that, by the way.
Yes, I look forward, to your optimistic take on the world. What gives first? NATO, global trade? It is certainly not looking like it'll be Donald Trump.
It's a bit of a toss-up. A couple things to keep in mind between the demographic aging going around the world and a reorientation of American strategic policy that long predates Donald Trump. We were always going to get to some version of where we are. And when you look at the European Union, which was optimized to, in essence, export to a globalized world, that model was always going to either break or change. And we just happen to now be at the moment. The hard part of my job is figuring out when things happen, not so much what.
But so it is about geography, it is about demographics, but it is also about personality here, though, isn't it? It is all about the
Absolutely.
peculiarities of Donald Trump's personality. I mean, American politics, it used to be, it's the economy stupid. For Donald Trump, it appears to be the land stupid. Is that right?
I wouldn't even say it's that complicated. The United States has had a bipartisan foreign and strategic policy since 1945, specifically because we knew we could not stand up to the Soviets by ourselves. We needed the alliance, and in creating that alliance, we basically paid everyone to be on our side. We used our Navy to allow global trade, to enforce global trade, and we opened our markets. That was our side of the deal. In exchange, we get to write Europe's security policies. That was always going to be abandoned at some point. I would have liked to have seen it renegotiated for a new age, but the last several presidents couldn't be bothered, and so now Donald Trump is drop kicking the entire thing to the side. So it's not about any one specific thing. It's about Trump has now cleaned house, and 2 generations of strategic thinkers in the United States are for the first time not part of the process. And he has made sure he has surrounded himself with people who will never upstage him. So it's not the economy, it's not land, it's him and only him.
And does that mean you talk about, abandoning the international order that was forged after the Second World War predominantly? Is that completely abandoned now? Is this the end of NATO, for example?
NATO is still up in the air. NATO has a number of reasons why it would still be relevant to American interests. The question is whether Donald Trump sees them that way. When you remove all of the institutions that have built this system and remove the people who have kept it alive, and you don't put in a replacement, that is when you can get truly radical change that is damaging to any number of things. And one of those number of things is American security, which is the path that we are on right now. This isn't just about Europe. This is about the United States finding a new way, but doing it through the thoughts of one person as a side project to everything else he's doing.
I mean, you talk about the thoughts of one person. Let's look specifically at the whole Greenland issue, which is at the top of the headlines at the moment. Why is he so obsessed with it? Exactly. Maybe not by the end of today, but at the moment it's right up there at the top. He gave the security argument that you talked about. People have talked about the argument that he wants the rare earth minerals. In the last couple of weeks, he seems to be just saying, I want it. I need it psychologically, he said. I mean, surely with Donald Trump, that's got to be the hardest argument to engage with, something that he wants psychologically.
What's happened around the White House is everyone who's involved in the Defense Department realizes that there's nothing to be gained from a presence or ownership of Greenland. It's 80% ice cap, so even with the most aggressive form of climate change, it's not going to be usable before the end of this century. Of the land that is not ice cap, there are no good port structures from a geographic point of view. And the one place where there could be a deep water port, it has icebergs 12 months of the year. So the cost to do anything here would be immense. And if there was rare earths, and keep in mind, rare earths are trace materials that are produced as a byproduct of other mining, they never produce or they're never present in more than 1/100 billionth concentration. So now you would have to what, do a mine in a place with no people with hostile weather, and you can't ship the rock out because you can't build a good port. So you have to build a refining place in there without a power. Yeah, yeah. You're talking about $1 trillion investment to make anything happen. It's not worth it. And from a strategic point of view, the north and the northeastern sides that face, say, Russian waters, the ice comes right down to the sea. There's nothing strategic here at all. So the strategic thinkers around the Trump administration, people who are within the bureaucracy, the Defense Department, have tried to lay out that it doesn't work for this, it doesn't work for this, it doesn't work for this, it doesn't work for this. All you get out of it is in a penguin free Antarctica. And so we have now seen it boil down to just him saying, I want it because I said I want it. And that, unfortunately, at this moment in time, is formal American security policy.
So, do we take, as a lot of commentators are saying, that this is bluff and bluster that is actually going nowhere? Or is there a route by which that desperate desire to own it keeps driving him forward?
Remember, what goes on in his head is the only strategic thinking that is happening in the United States right now. He has already ordered on multiple occasions for the Joint Chiefs to draw up military plans to seize it directly, which the US obviously could do very easily if it wanted to. The consequences of that, of course, are so horrific for American economics and security that the same people have tried to distract him with every possible other thing. It just hasn't worked.
And there is so much now relying on Europe. In the last 24 hours, he's been taking pot shots at the UK over that Chagos Island deal, which I think the administration once said was a really good deal. Today, Donald Trump has reported as saying it is an act of great stupidity. And he says it's the reason why the US must now have Greenland. What's your take on that?
I don't want to sign too much logic here, but the Chagos deal is a little questionable. You take one of the most valuable pieces of territory in the Eastern Hemisphere and you put the military use of it in question. I can understand why that might upset some strategic thinkers in multiple countries. Um, whether or not that is the logic for this is an open question. Keep in mind that it was just 2 days ago that Donald Trump sent a letter to the leaders of Norway saying that since he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, he was going to invade Greenland. So drawing connections logically are not the forte of this administration.
Well, on that point, I mean, the rest of the world has to and continually
Yes.
reacts to what he says and to what he does. Is Trump now a bigger threat to NATO than Vladimir Putin?
No. Keep in mind that because of the change in American strategic posture pre-Trump, and because of the demographic shift, Europe was already going to have to do everything differently. Europe was always going to have to spend 5 times as much on defense as they had been, because the United States was going to be interested in other things closer to home. Trump is just doing that with more flair. Europe was always going to have to reshuffle the way its economy works away from export-led industries into domestic consumption, which I realize is very low because of the age nature of the population. But we were always going to get here, and Europe was always going to have to deal with the Russians, maybe not on their own, but with a slimmer slice of allies than they had before. And that meant European decision making had to become much more robust. This was always where we were going to get. I just didn't think we were going to get here until like 2030, 2035.
Do you think Europeans also thought we wouldn't get here that soon either?
I would argue, with a couple of exceptions in places like Warsaw or Riga, most Europeans thought that they would never get here. And if you look at back in the world since 1945, it's been pretty good to be in Europe. The Americans do the heavy lifting strategically. They were able to build out their social support networks in a way that avoided some of the social stresses that had ripped their countries apart over and over and over in the previous half millennium. And they never had to fight themselves. It has been a good globalization under the American aegis has been a great time to be European,
And that's
but it
been a
was
big
always
part of
temporary.
Trump's argument, hasn't it? That's
It
been a
has
big part
been,
of Trump's argument.
and not just Trump, also Biden, also Obama, also W, also Clinton. You could argue that the writing has been on the wall for a while. It's just that having it all happen in an idle weekend is a bit of a shock.
So, to the next prediction, if you would, how does Europe confront this situation now?
Well, you're really going to hate this answer. Uh, we're going through a revolution in military affairs at the moment. We're seeing Russia and Ukraine reinvent from the ground up what warfare looks like. And even if the Europeans had been spending 3 to 5% of GDP on defense these past 25 years, they would probably discover that most of the hardware they had, most of the training they had done, most of the planning they had done wouldn't be applicable to the way that war is evolving. That applies to the United States too. There isn't time for Europe to devise a conventional solution to the challenge that is now on its eastern periphery. However, as we know, nuclear weapons are 1940s technology, and there are any number of countries that are included but are not limited to Lithuania, Poland, Germany, Finland, Sweden, and Romania, who could develop a crude nuclear device in a matter of weeks if they wanted to. We're now at the point where there's active political discussions going on all those countries and more about how to prepare for what's next, and nukes are absolutely part of the conversation.
So that means European leaders have to keep Donald Trump on board and in NATO, don't they? And not
Well,
pursuing
that would
this.
absolutely be the preference. Yes,
Well,
America
there's
and
no
Europe are
choice,
obviously
surely.
stronger together. Well, there is a choice. It's just the choice isn't theirs. The United States, for better or for worse, has other options. I'm not saying that these are ones I would even remotely endorse. If the United States does decide to move on Greenland, attack a NATO ally, that is effectively the end of NATO. And it's certainly the end of the partnership with the Scandinavian and Nordic countries, which is likely to be the backbone of future American European engagement, assuming that the relationship is allowed to mature. That's where the demographics are healthier. That's where the militaries are more capable. That's where geostrategic alignments have always been strongest. And now with Finland and Sweden as part of the alliance, it could be a very, very, very robust partnership, but not if you attack one of their own. The United States doesn't have an internationalized economy. And that was even before we started reshoring some of our manufacturing a few years ago. The US doesn't need the world. It's better with the world. It's a stronger economy. It's a better system. It's cheaper, but it does have other options. The Europeans can't choose anything else. And that means Europe has to transform not just politically and economically and institutionally, but also strategically. And that requires going back to a time that the Europeans in the past have shown they're not very good at long term, over the horizon strategic thinking. Every time that the Europeans have tried that, it's led to a European civil war. I'm not saying that it's destined to do that this time, but there's a lot more stress this time than there was in the last round.
So, how critical is it now in terms of how Europe responds to the threat against Greenland and what they do next?
Donald Trump is not getting good advice because he doesn't have good advisors, with maybe one or two exceptions. And so, as the Europeans discovered in the last NATO summit, if you slather on the praise thick, get him thinking about something else, eventually the summit ends and he goes away. That is still the best hope for Europe. They can't give him Greenland because that would shatter the relationship. on all sides. Any government that signed up to that would be overthrown by their own people very quickly. The European countries are not the United States. You have a say in who your leaders are more than once every 4 years. You can do votes of no confidence. We can't do that here. And you can shift out the party alliance that makes the government possible. In the United States, we don't even have two parties anymore. They've basically broken down past the point of no return. You are at a moment where you are more flexible than we are. And even though there are now Republican senators in Congress openly discussing impeachment of the president, the chances of getting the two-thirds majority that would be required are very, very low without something a lot more egregious than Greenland. Now, the Trump administration is working on a few of those items. Watch Minnesota. That could break ugly very, very quickly based on how things are going. But even if Trump were to magically be voted out tomorrow, the U.S. has changed. U.S. strategic priorities are different, and we are unlikely to be coming back.
But in terms of the discussions that are going on right now about how Europe and how European leaders, how the UK should respond in terms even of reciprocal tariffs, what's noticeable is how polite many of those European leaders, particularly perhaps the British Prime Minister, is continuing to be. Meanwhile, we've got Governor Newsom saying Europe needs to grow a spine. Interesting how the Americans don't feel as obliged to be quite so polite in their language. But but Europe has to show a sign of strength somehow, doesn't it, here?
Well, you have to decide what you want. Do you want to attempt to salvage the relationship with a United States that is becoming more erratic, independent of Trump? Or do you want to get on with it and build an independent capacity and find a way to share power with the French and the Germans and the others? Neither of these are particularly palatable options. I'm not suggesting there's anything about this that is an easier choice, but as long as you're pandering to Trump, you hold out the hope that today is not the day that that breaks. For the United Kingdom specifically, this is going to sound really harsh. Sorry. We've been
At least you
dancing
always
around this.
apologize before you're
Yeah.
harsh.
I went to university in New Zealand. There's a little bit of politeness in me. Uh, it's been almost a decade since Brexit. And every time the UK trade authorities have come to the United States to seek a deal, whether it's been under Biden or under Trump, the deal's been the same. You have to adopt US regulatory policies, you have to adopt US agricultural norms, you have to adopt US manufacturing norms and fold into North American systems. Airbus goes away, the city closes down, you're no longer a financial hub. These aren't mild points, but they're also not negotiable from an American point of view. The United Kingdom left Europe. It is on its own. It brings very little to the table in terms of trade talks. And so you either accept what Brussels says or you accept what Washington says. And we've been in this netherworld in between ever since. And with every day that Britain doesn't get a deal, its leverage gets weaker. And no one is going to make a concession. So the president or the prime minister right now is trying to struggle between these two impossible choices. Do we go back to Europe and fold in British defense decision making into French norms? Or do we functionally become the 51st state? There is not a middle road here.
As you predicted, it was a harsh answer. Meanwhile, the UK, the Prime Minister, continues to rely a great deal on a special relationship that looks less and less special, doesn't it?
It's not going to be special in the way that you want. It's not that Americans don't like and trust the Brits and respect the Brits and think the Brits have capacity. But that capacity really only functions now as an adjunct of American power. So either you need to build it up independently, which I don't think you can afford anymore, or you need to do it as part of a broader system, and your choice is American or European.
And more broadly, at this precise moment, the balancing act, not just for the UK, but for the rest of Europe, is trying also to keep President Trump on board for Ukraine.
In the hope that he will now be distracted by something else, say Cuba. And as long as we have the American strategic decision making apparatus so hamstrung and gutted, the US really can only focus on one international issue at at a time. Unfortunately, right now, the person who decides what that topic is in Europe.
From Europe, looking precisely on your doorstep to America now, you've got the midterms coming up. What, if
Mhm.
any, difference will they make?
I find it unlikely that we're going to have let's put impeachment to the side for the moment, because if we do have a break among the Republican senators, there is a possible path there. Not a likely one, but a possible one. But for impeachment, I'm sorry, but for the midterms, I really am not paying much attention to those at all, because while Donald Trump has gutted the Republican Party and turned it into a cult of personality and actively campaigns against anyone who is not slavishly loyal, the Democrats are in worse shape. They've completely detonated as an institution. They have no leadership. They have no common cause aside from "we're not Trump," and that is not enough. Because of the way American elections work, only one third of the Senate is up for election in any given election, or up for decision in any given election. So even if you have the Democrats sweep the House, which is very unlikely, they still wouldn't get enough votes in the Senate to force their way on any meaningful policy. So if you've been betting on the Democrats, you've been wrong for several years. This year is not unique.
I mean, you make a lot of bold predictions. It's your business. You predicted Donald Trump would lose that last election. Now that didn't
Fair.
happen. Would you say that was a misreading of him or a misreading of the American people?
Of the electorate. My forecast for that round was that independents, true independents, the one that make up only 10% of the population and decided the last 11 elections in the United States, that they had soured on Trump so holistically that it wasn't going to be enough for Trump to have a re-engaged base. And that group, that 110%, did vote for Kamala Harris by a factor of more than 3-1. However, Democrats voted for Trump, which is not something I anticipated. With the exception of independents and the state of Washington, every demographic in the United States shifted towards Trump by significant volumes, some by huge volumes, and that was more than enough to overcome what I had identified.
And I mean, would you say America's turning against Trump now, or is that
It's
again a point in time that may change once more?
Every president has a bit of a honeymoon in his first year. The second year and third year always sour. The question is whether that affects their power. Uh, Unique among American presidents, Trump came into this term with a majority in the House, in the Senate, and a supermajority in the courts. And yet, he hasn't relied on them at all. He's just worked with presidential power. He doesn't seem to care about the institution of Congress or the authority or durability that it might give his policies. We've really only had one functional bill pass in the entire year. It's difficult to see anything shy of a congressional resurgence, putting any meaningful limits on his power.
Looking more broadly, across the globe, one of your other big predictions is that China will collapse in the next decade. That's certainly not an outlook I would say lots of people would share. What's your analysis on that?
The short version is that the Chinese population started imploding back in the 90s. We now know that according to official Chinese statistics, the American birth rate has been higher than the Chinese birth rate since 1991. And they're now shrinking, according to their formal statistics, by more than 6 million people a year. Uh, Informally, within the Shanghai Academy of Sciences, they're having an open debate about how many people they have overcounted. The low ball number is about 100 million. The higher ball number is closer to 350 million. And if you go somewhere in the middle of that, it suggests that the average age in China is already 54, which is older than any country in Europe. So, demographically speaking, they're not going to be able to maintain the production levels. They already have seen consumption levels fall off. They're having problems with their tax base, and they are completely dependent on exports to maintain their economic and political systems. That has no more than 10 years to run.
I mean, the Chinese obviously had that one child policy, which presumably is partly what's left them to the sort of demographic time bomb they're facing now. But I mean, could they introduce a two, three, four child policy to reverse the change?
Couple of problems there. One child policy was absolutely part of the problem, but the real issue was that they just industrialized too fast. In a single generation, they went from 90% of the population living in rice farms to 60% of the population living in high rise condos. There's simply no room to have children anymore. part of what we're seeing across the Chinese space now is even when they liberalized one child and went to two child, three child, and now as many as you want, the birth rate actually went down. There no longer is enough people, or no longer are enough people under age 40 to even pretend to regenerate the demographic structure. The question is just how gutted is it? Give you an idea of how desperate it's gotten for people under 30. The new top app that is being downloaded by parents for their kids in China is called Are You Alive? Because suicide has become so robust, job opportunities for the young have become so poor, and so many people are living alone because they can't afford to do otherwise.
I mean, one of the things that people who think the prediction of, China's collapse is a bit premature, one of the things they say is that, you're not necessarily factoring in what the Chinese leader might do to improve things.
Certainly. We're getting a lesson in that from Donald Trump right now, because in many ways he's modeling his decision making process off of Xi Jinping. It's been 8 years now since Xi Jinping last purged his cabinet of anyone who would speak to him about the truth. And now he's just been ingesting propaganda that kind of messes with your decision making. So we see a lot of disconnects in policy in China, where an order is handed down from this guy who has written something like, geez, what is it? 300,000 pages of ideological treatises in the last 25 years. And as somebody who's written a few books, 300,000 pages is a lot.
It's a lot.
Uh, he can't keep track of the policy, even if people still provide him with the information, because he punishes people who bring him information he doesn't like. So they just stop collecting that statistic. So we don't have good eyes into China anymore because the government statistics have become meaningless, and companies that did things like due diligence have been chased out of the country. So we're just left with this kind of blank wall and our fear, and Americans are very good in filling in the blanks when they're motivated by fear.
And so if this collapse does happen, say, within a decade, what does the world order look like then?
Well, that's a longer conversation than we probably have time for, but let me give you a couple first and second order
I was
effects.
tempted to say
Uh,
briefly, but it seemed ridiculous.
yeah. Yeah. Number one, China, because of its economic model, which is based on over financialization, basically they print currency and confiscate private savings to fund everything. And that makes them price insensitive for everything from cement to copper to oil. The world's largest consumer of everything for raw materials goes to zero in a very short period of time. That, for example, would be very bad for Russia, Australia, and Saudi Arabia, just to pick three. Second, China is the workshop of the world. They have cornered the market and all the low tech manufacturing and assembly that no one else can do, and they do it at scale. That goes away. So we need to find a new way to manufacture product, because nowhere else in the world is there a large cadre of behaved uh, folks who will do that they're told for relatively modest compensation. So maybe that's automation, but we have to do it quickly and with less capital than we have before. Maybe it means that we all have to take a hit to our standard of living and get back into manufacturing in a very big way. There's a lot of choices that will color what happens, but the biggest issue is going to be strategic. The United States right now has 12 supercarriers. We're in the process of updating some of our older ones with newer models. The Ford class is now out. The second one is going through sea trials, and it's designed to fight in multiple theaters at the same time. You remove the Chinese threat, the United States still has the hardware. So imagine, if you will, an America with global reach, but not even regional interests. We got a glimpse of what that looks like in Venezuela last month.
I mean,
Play that forward, and you get a very dynamic world.
all roads lead back to Donald Trump, and you're talking about more conflict. It may be a world of peace if his board of peace works the way he's
Mm.
promising that he's created in the Middle East. I mean, what is going on there?
That's a great question. I don't think anybody has a good idea. The Board of Peace, as it's called, is supposed to administrate a territory that no one has ever been able to administrate, and it's supposed to do so without money and without troops. I'm a little skeptical.
And countries for the mere price of $1 billion can be on it. And it almost doesn't
Yeah.
matter who
Now,
you are. I believe the invitation's gone out to Putin, to Belarus.
yeah, I don't want to put words in any president or prime minister's mouth, but for $1 billion, I would pay that happily to not have to deal with Gaza.
And there is also the issue in the region of Iran. I mean, Trump did strike Iran before in the 12-day war, as it was called, the 12-day strike. Will he do it again?
Never rule it out, but something interesting happened last week when the decision was made to not strike Iran. He was convinced by national security personnel in the Pentagon that no matter how many bombs you drop on Iran, you're probably not going to change the regime. And so all of a sudden, he went from thinking that he'd pull a second Maduro to realizing that sometimes in some places, just going in with Delta Force isn't going to solve the problem. See, in Venezuela, we had one guy who was a thug and a thief surrounded by a small cluster of other thugs and other thieves. And getting him out was easy because the not just the military system in Venezuela was a joke, but there was no structure in place to rule the country as you would rule another place. Iran has many faults, but that's not one of them. And while you definitely have people that enrich themselves at the expense of the Iranian people, the mullahs are the ruling class, and there's over 10,000 of them. So even if you were to nuke Tehran, you don't actually break the regime. And eventually, that pushed into Trump's head, and he realized that this wasn't going to be quick and simple. It's not the first time that that has happened in this administration. It also happened when the United States was dealing with the Houthis down in the Red Sea. It was laid out. Trump said, like, if this is not over in 30 days, we're done. And there is no way that you can fix Yemen in 30 days. People have literally been trying for centuries. And so after 30 days, almost to the day, US forces stopped doing what they were doing. You just have to get the message to him through a venue that he can assimilate. And that doesn't happen anywhere but the White House so far.
But even on the border of peace, it was first being established for Gaza, but now seems to have spread to conflicts, as you say, Venezuela, across the world. I mean, a sort of Trumpian United Nations.
Having a new United Nations that Trump personally manages, if you want it to actually do anything, requires a degree of consistency out of American foreign policy that we haven't seen in a long time. And that's not just a Trump critique. Uh, it also requires a lot more funding than the United States is willing to put in, and troops on the ground in a way that this administration is simply not willing to consider. And I would argue neither would have the last three, uh, which puts everybody in an interesting position. Trump has his issue of the moment. If he talks about the peace board as opposed to Greenland while he's in Davos, that is a big win because it doesn't have nearly as many strategic implications because ultimately the United States is not going to put money into that either. You just have to keep Trump focused on something else.
You said it a couple of times during the conversation. I'm sorry, it's going to be a bleak answer. When you look ahead, say to the next decade, is it all bleak?
Globalized capitalism in its current form requires a global consuming class, and that requires a lot of people under age 45. A decade from now, there won't be enough of those people to maintain that model. We're going to have to figure out something else new. Now, in the United States, we still are not in a position where we have more deaths than births, like France just crossed into this last year. So now everyone in Europe is in that bucket. Everyone in Northeast Asia has been in that bucket for years, which means that for the United States, we don't have to figure that out. We can continue with our economic model more or less intact. We're going to have to change how we do manufacturing as the Chinese go away, but that is in many ways, an opportunity of growth, crisis of growth as anything else. But changing the way you think of strategic thinking, changing the way you think of your global strategy, changing the way that you handle your economic model, which will refabricate every political relationship on the planet. That is the challenge for the next decade. I'm not suggesting that ends in bloodshed and horror for everyone. What I'm saying is it is change. And going through that much change in that short of a period of time will generate stresses internally for every country, every transnational organization, and it will drastically alter this concept we have called trade, which can't exist without a global guarantor of security. All of that has to shift. All of that has to shift in less than 10 years. History tells us that that will be a rugged time, but that does not mean that there won't be winners. There are countries with good geographies, good industrial plant, energy options, agricultural options, and a certain amount of distance from potential rivals that allows them to actually do very, very well in a world that is globalized. Globalization was designed to help countries that didn't have those things unite into an alliance against the Soviets. You break that alliance, you still have those core features that work well. The United Kingdom's on that list. France is on that list. Japan is on that list. Argentina's on that list. It's not bad for everybody, but it is going to be a radically different way of thinking and operating. And the less time you have to make the adjustments, the more likely things are to get rough.
And we look at the speed at which things appear to happen and the flip flopping and the change in strategy and policy that we've seen in the last year from President Trump. We have 3 more years potentially. What will his legacy be? How much of his presidency this time round will be dictating the shape of the modern world?
Question is whether Trump gets around to building anything. Right now, he has proven he's very good at breaking things, and the global order is one of those things. But the presidents that ultimately reshape the world in a way that sticks are the ones who build new institutions to take advantage of the changes in circumstance. There's a reason that the four men who are in Mount Rushmore are who they are. They were creators of a new world, not breakers of the old. And I have no doubt that 20 years from now, we'll be looking back on this era, and everyone in the United States is going to be more than a little embarrassed.
And how does the how do you fight that though? Is there any chance that that will be fought? This idea that you may well break institutions and rip up the international order, but if you don't rebuild, what's the danger there?
Well, remember, Trump is the oldest president we've ever had. He won't be around for that. He doesn't care. The real challenge from my point of view, as an apolitical or tries to be apolitical American, is we at the moment don't have a two-party system. And it's probably going to take us more than another 3 years to reformulate into something fresh. So when we get around to our next general election 3 years from now, we're going to have basically a personality contest uh, without policy. And so I'm not so much concerned about the era between now and 2028. I'm concerned about 2028 to 2032. Because once the global system is broken and the United States isn't intellectually capable of building new institutions, that's when things get dangerous.
Can I just ask, when you talk about, it being driven by personality but not policy, in a sense, isn't that where the electorate in various countries across the world end up being left? They are drawn to personalities. They are less interested in policy.
Uh, and if historically speaking, that is very true as well. One of the things that I have been learning as I've been going back looking for other eras where there's a moment like this, a hegemon that kind of loses it at the top, it's unfortunately it echoes quite a bit. So around the world, trust in the old, for lack of a better phrase, bipartisan system that ruled the world from 1946 to the present, reshaped everyone's internal political policies. And now, as that system breaks down, we're seeing populism, whether it's on the left or the right, becoming much, much, much more robust. That is true in every democracy. It's also true in the autocracies. And it has been true before. My goal as a historian is to hopefully hold enough of what worked from this old system and carry it into whatever happens to be for the new. Don't just let it all wash away like it has on multiple occasions throughout world history. We're not off to a great start.
But I suppose the point is, populism brings what people want, doesn't it?
Populism brings what people want right now. The problem is it's not very well considered typically, and it doesn't take a very long view. I kind of consider it, think of the cultural muscle tone of Iraq versus the United Kingdom. The Brits know how to cue because ultimately they know they have over a millennium of political history behind them, and they know their institutions will eventually reset even if they have a bad leadership. In Iraq, they've never had good leadership. And so if somebody's car stalls on the side of the road, they strip it down to the studs immediately because that's the only thing that they ever see themselves getting. We have a degree of continuity in the West that a lot of the rest of the world doesn't have. We'll come through this. The question is, will we fall far enough that we start stripping that stalled vehicle, or do we start remembering some of the things that have gotten us to this point and use that to build whatever's next?
Peter, we've taken you all around the world. I wonder, given that we've talked about everything else, will Brooklyn Beckham ever make up with his mum?
Time will tell.
That will that conflict ever be solved?
It's easier than Gaza, I'll give it that.
Peter Zeihan, thank you so much for talking to us.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. Well, that is it for this episode of the Forecast. Until next time, goodbye.